I think it's working. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Thought Leadership series on the journey to the cloud. Here we will explore how to make your cloud journey. Rick, next slide. My name is Michael Kent. I'm the CTO for RiverMeadow. I've been kicking around this side of migration for somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 years. I'm also pleased that we have with us today Stefana Muller from Second Watch. Stefana, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Stefana Muller. I'm a senior product manager at Second Watch, and I focus on cloud migration, security, optimization, and helping clients move to cloud native technologies. I've spent about 20 years in this space in large enterprise technology and in software development, and I hope to share some of my experiences with you today.
Great. Let's go ahead and dive in. Rick, next slide.
So the first start of understanding cloud migration is understanding the challenges you may face. Companies have been moving to cloud for years now. This is nothing new, right? The interesting thing about it is the stats show that there's more companies moving now than there were obviously 5 years ago. Matter of fact, 5 years ago when I was moving my infrastructure to cloud, I had thought everything was already there and I was behind the ball. But the interesting thing is that about, there's tons of companies today that are just starting this journey. And as they're starting the journey, they're realizing that the methods and the technology used has evolved over the time, and the process has gotten more complex. So project delays, budget challenges, long-term schedules, they seem to happen for many enterprises in this space still today, even though we've been doing this for about 10 years. In fact, a stat from Dimensional Research shows that about 57% of application migration projects take longer than planned, and nearly half exceed the project budget. Those numbers don't instill confidence in the process if you're me or if you're a part of an enterprise trying to go through this process. So I think I kind of drilled down this checklist of challenges to a few reasons, and I actually would like to point out 2 reasons that fuel these challenges. One is a lack of understanding of the current application landscape. So basically your CMDB is out of date or your dependencies are clearly not identified between your applications or different servers. And number 2 on my list of the reasons for these challenges is a lack of cloud expertise. Many customers of ours lack the understanding of the cloud native technologies. They haven't yet used infrastructure as code. There's an education gap between their traditional sysadmins who've been working in the data center for many years to the newer cloud engineer role. So these new technologies and the move over to cloud requires that organizational shift as well. The good news is that there's methods to combat all these challenges before you start a migration project, and that's what we'll kind of dive into today.
Great, next slide.
So this slide just kind of outlines the typical cloud migration process. We went through, or rather, Michael, you went through in the previous presentations in the series through the discover process of identifying and analyzing the existing environment on-prem, figuring out your total cost of ownership, and so on. What I'd like to dive deeper into today is the plan, design, and deploy areas. First, in plan, this is where we're going to break down your servers into applications or workloads. You may have 3,000 servers, but that means about 300 or so applications that you're trying to move over. We want to think in an application sense because that's where the dependencies lie. We're going to go into your software license strategies when you move over to cloud. Get that in the planning well before going into the design of your infrastructure. Analyzing network, security, storage, databases, things like that. Also figuring out your min and max requirements for the performance of your applications. You want to get that down pretty pat early on in the process. After you go through this plan process and have some of that documentation set, and And throughout this plan, design, deploy, you're going to be documenting along the way. And that's key to making this successful and making sure that you can manage your application once it's in the cloud. But the second step here is design. And this is where I think it's kind of a misnomer to call it design. We're not just designing your infrastructure, but we're setting up your subscription and your organization structure in the cloud. And this is really your account and billing structure. This stuff has to be done well before you decide to move something there. I have a lot of clients that tell me, oh yeah, we've got a few things already in cloud. And the funny thing about it is the one biggest pain point that we see is that the subscription structure isn't set up properly for name and the naming and the tagging strategy isn't set up properly for them to go and charge back the right departments in their large enterprise.
Sure, I think there's a lot of organic growth in cloud. I think a lot of folks started early, dipped their toe, and now they're trying to reuse some of those resources to move forward, and they're not really suitable for task.
Yeah, a lot of the times we find that reuse of the existing environment causes them to delay their project because they're trying to fit their very massive migration into this environment that was built for a specific development team. So that's a very good point, Michael. I also think during this stage, and I'd like to point out that we do a pre-flight migration test and make sure that our UAT plans are set well before we get into the deploy phase. And this is, obviously building your foundational infrastructure as well. So some people like to call it a landing zone. I like to call it the foundational infrastructure. You need somewhere that your applications can land once you start the migration. So that's what we're building in the design phase.
It seems like it's also the area where some of the lifecycle management, and we'll cover more of this really in part 4 of the Thought Leadership series, but it seems like here's where you want to begin the implementation as you have here on the security, the policy, the management, and the architecture that you're going to end up having to live with. What's nice about that, Stefana, and tell me your thoughts, of course, are it seems that's a great way to test those new changes in how you have to work and where you need to work as you ramp up on the technology, get your training, make a bit of a culture shift well before you need it ready for prime time. So it seems like you kind of get to grow and change along with that infrastructure design.
Absolutely. I think that you were spot on with that. I also want to add one other thing that gets kind of missed in the process is that configuration management, that infrastructure as code tooling to make sure that all of this could be automated, right, in the future. And that when you move to cloud, you're not just stuck there with the existing environment. You are set to continuously and be agile with your applications. So that is something that that we like to make sure that is coupled into that design phase. You mentioned also getting that organizational shift together and helping through the design phase. I think one of the key things is the documentation of that. So if you have a policy documenting it, if you have a plan for handling outages or challenges or changes, make sure that's documented during this phase so that you're creating that quote unquote center of excellence paperwork so that your team is really prepared for that final deployment and running in the cloud. So the fourth area and in this process, the one that is, the one that everyone thinks is the simple part actually is the simple part in my mind, right? Once you go through plan and design, you're getting to the full the cloud migration. And in large migrations, you might have 1,000 servers moving or 100 applications moving at once during this deploy phase. These exist and can happen quickly in a limited downtime if we plan accordingly. There are also smaller migrations that can take more time due to the movement of large databases or intricate dependencies. So we want to, during this phase, understand that migration schedule, understand our runbook for each using the documentation we built before, capture that information, transport that data over, which could take time depending on bandwidth, and then do some of that configuration before cutting over.
Well, it seems to me, Stefania, that to really engage this, we in the previous slide we spoke about this lack of expertise. It seems like there's a great deal of change, a great deal of different technologies and methods that ultimately get employed in the design and, more specifically in the deploy phase. And I think that's really kind of what we're hinting at is, of course, given enough time and enough resources, everyone will be cloud conversant, et cetera. But these techniques and how fast they change and how fast the requirements around the technology change seems to be one of those sore points, at least in our practice, where we find a lot of people having some challenge where they just need a sounding board or something to help them stay on track.
Absolutely. I think that, hate to plug my company, but that's pretty much what we're there for, right? We've done this for 10 years now and gone through this process and made some mistakes along the way. And at this point, understand how to address those challenges very quickly so that you're not seeing downtime, you're not seeing a rollback, you're not seeing a budget overspent in this process. Definitely something that is required is that expertise, whether you bring that in-house or have an external partner to help you do that.
Great. So Stefania, can you talk about some of the methodology that you would use to go through this process? How do you start breaking that down and really
Sure.
Bucketing these from an execution phase?
Absolutely. So if we go to thank you, Rick. So we're on the next slide, and this is the 5 R's. I'd like to call them this. It really, back in 2011, Gartner created and outlined 5 strategies for migrating cloud to cloud, and they used the R's, right? I've adapted these, I guess you could say, based on the current landscape, based on what we've seen in our 10 years of migrating to cloud. So let's actually pinch and zoom on each of these and understand what they each mean for your migration. If we start in the upper left, the rehost is sometimes called the lift and shift. This is where most enterprises think their workloads reside, that everything is just going to move over to cloud and everyone will be happy. We hope, right, the majority of your workloads reside in this bucket. This is where you can really automate the process to get into cloud. You don't have to have that much downtime. Maybe there's just a flip of a switch and everything is now moved from your traffic is moved from one area to another. We hope that this is again the majority, more than 50% of your workloads. The challenge we see is that this doesn't exist everywhere, right? Especially in those large transformational projects. So with the rehost, though, what we do is we employ a migration through some certain tools so that we can reduce the downtime, we can test things out, and we migrate over the non-production workloads first, and then move over to the production systems to increase the confidence along the way. It also teaches the team how to go through this process. So most of the migrations we work on are a quote unquote do it with me model, where we're going to help our clients go through this process and not try to do it for them, because they need to understand how this works. The second area here is the retain area. And, I'm going to scream it out loud, but there are workloads that do not need to move to cloud. By the way, there's not enough blogs on this. So if anyone has a blog idea, there you go, or needs a blog idea. There are workloads that are dependent on specific hardware or software, and you probably shouldn't move your AS400 to cloud because it's probably more cost efficient for you to keep it where it is, or in a colo facility instead. So if you're planning on replacing a workload over time with another service or in the near future, or if it's dependent on certain hardware, you're probably best to leave it there for a little while and have a plan for it in the future. Then you've got your retire, which is right below retain. This is funny. We go through these processes all the time. You don't realize how much waste you have in your existing environment, in your existing data centers. Many times we see 20 to 30% of workloads are no longer needed after we do the assessment in those plan and design phases. So this is something to consider. You're reducing costs, you're reducing the need for security for these workloads that aren't used anymore or are not useful for the future of your company.
So that's great information. And so I guess on this, maybe before we move on, I guess my question is, you had mentioned rehost and replatform is really kind of the bulk of it. And I think that there's this misconception that moving to the cloud is a great deal of refactoring. And it seems to me that ultimately a migration project is a balance between some strategic and tactical needs. You covered it a little bit in the retain. I have an AS400. I really don't know how I'm going to break this down and move it to the cloud. What do I do with it? And we also see it, I think, sometimes with compliance systems. You may it may just be too much of a question, or tracking down that application owner, or getting the right certifications or what have you, or just taking time. And then I think you can include that in a strategic plan that really says, hey, we spoke earlier about a value map, right? And in the value map, let's take some things that provide some value today and get those moving. And then we can come back and readdress some of those other things that either don't have as much value or might need some other special handling, like you said, retain until retire, or some other way to sunset that application, replace it, or modernize it.
Absolutely. So I think you'll see, and I'm going to go into a little bit more depth with the rehost and replatform. We hope the majority of your work is rehost, but there's going to be some replatform, and there is going to be a small set of refactoring.
I'd love to see some numbers on that.
Yeah,
absolutely. Do we have some numbers we can show?
We of course have some numbers. Here's an example. Here's an example of what one of our clients went through recently, and this is a large organization, multinational, who has multiple data centers that they are either co-load with or own, and they're trying to sunset those data centers. They've gone through and, after initial assessment showed in that discovery session, we showed about 3,000 servers or more that needed to be migrated to cloud in some way, shape, or form, or sunset. So then we broke it down. After figuring out those 3,000 servers, we broke it down to the 361 applications, to be exact. And out of those, 162 of them were actually in scope for cloud. So that's, about 40% of the workloads were cloud ready, or ready to be rehosted or replatformed into cloud. The rest were either going to be retired or retained, so in their existing form. And I think that's an interesting thing. We often think that that everything is going to move over, right? and the answer is not everything's going to move over. There are reasons to retire things. There are reasons to retain. And this is, again, a very large organization that was moving and wants to do it quickly, but wants to do it in a cost-effective way. I want to dive deeper into the replatform, refactor areas here. So I mentioned it. I didn't explain replatform in depth, but one of the key things on replatform is this is when you're moving to cloud and using cloud native technologies to do so. So this may mean moving your SQL server to Azure's cloud database as a service, which is a PaaS service, or Amazon RDS, so that you can use a cloud native technology, but you're not redoing the entire application. You're just changing the database over. This is similar to a rehost. Most of the application is moving to the cloud unchanged, but there's those minor changes that make that underlying infrastructure very much more supportive of cloud, and you gain that efficiency over that time. And if you're going to a PaaS, for example, you don't have to manage or maintain the upgrades of that database software, which is nice, right? And you're reducing the cost and the turmoil there.
Sure.
And
well,
then
so
go ahead.
I'm sorry. What I was going to say is, do we have, maybe can we look at a bit of the process? So we kind of know at this point a representative example of kind of the mix, if you will.
Yes.
What's going to retain, what's going to rehost, what's going to replatform. What's now if we, again, on your pinch and zoom, if we zoom in a layer, maybe we can talk through some of the planning and methodology, really how it breaks down from a process flow perspective, and see kind of what that looks like and add color as we go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we look at the kind of a methodology, it's not the only methodology. There's a ton of methodologies, and I'm sure, Stefana, in your business, you tend to tailor the methodology to the purpose, to the actual migration task. But here's just an example of a methodology that I've used in the past to go through this process. There's, of course, the infrastructure discovery that we spoke about before. We have some things in here that you've talked about as well: source validation and pre-flight migration checking, the collection of dependencies into kind of a common terminology as a wave or a move group, right? You'll see on here, we are also pretty keen on actually, if possible, talking to an application owner. They tend to know where the bones are buried. They always have some sort of insight, and ultimately, if we can get them engaged early, they can influence some of those refactor decisions, as well as the UAT testing that ultimately you would want to have as an output before you go into your bigger, larger, more complex applications, before you do your code over, that kind of process. In the migration design, as you mentioned, again, here we use that term landing zone, a foundational architecture, if you will. And then really the creation of a runbook for each of those applications that put a set of loving arms around that application as we manage it into that migration deployment, which includes things like UAT testing, full migration, any delta syncing, go, no-go meetings, code over activities, notification, all these kind of things. And you'll see there that we loop that. And the idea is to take an iterative approach to all of that as well, to cycle through a block of applications. And ultimately, we find that if you start small and you do something low risk and relatively easy, that kind of helps prime all the teams for what's coming next and what's coming next. And you learn and you grow as you move into bigger, riskier, larger applications with confidence. And as we mentioned in the previous slide, with a set of management capabilities in that target cloud that make sure that not only are you landing it in the right place, but it's being taken care of. So all of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt around cost containment and what is this really going to do, and security and these kind of things, they've been answered and they can be tested. So I think that's great. We have some use cases, Stefana. Can we talk through some of those use cases specifically?
Sure. I'm going to focus on the left side first, and Condé Nast is migrating over 300 servers to cloud to make sure they're getting that agility. I think one of the big things, their big goal and purpose, was to move out of their very large data center, which hosted all their mission critical run the business applications. So in this case, because they're trying to move over very quickly, what we were working to do is get those 300 systems into the public cloud as quickly as possible with minimal downtime. And, again, the goal was to get out of the data center, and we did that in less than 2 months. That can definitely happen. The full assessment was done, and the process that I outlined earlier was followed. We were still able to cut operating costs and improve performance throughout that process. So that's a very successful way of getting to cloud. That
seems like they had to move in a hurry, and so it also seems that, of course, there's no one reason to do a migration, right? There are different business drivers, and that seems like to be able to both hit a near-term tactical business driver as well as get some performance increase. That seems like a great story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of drives into a completely different model, which is the second one, which is a leading global media company. Their key was to migrate specific applications to public cloud and do a cloud native refactor in the process. They were already in Azure with most of their existing infrastructure. So it wasn't a rush out of a data center here. It was more of, hey, we have now our real critical applications and we want to move it over to cloud in a very methodical way. So again, 1 week to 2 months, depending on the application, we move things over. But the key here was to make everything refactored along the way. So that, that was a very different goal and mindset. But again, similar results, the minimal downtime, the very quick movement over to cloud.
Sure, and we saw the same thing in the last use case as well. Customer had to dramatically reshape some aspects. They got surprised by the need or a business shift away from some real estate, some data centers that they had, and they had to move quickly and to be able to bridge that gap into cloud. And really, they didn't have a great deal of resources to do it. And so that last use case is really about moving. It was 66 applications spread across 745 or so different servers, actual instances, a mix of Windows and Linux, and that was accomplished in about 4 months. And again, I think when you're tactical, as long as your migration plan accounts for it, your foundational infrastructure is in place and your management routines are in place, that can still be very, very successful. And then we can come back to it. So I want to open it up for any questions that anyone might have that is actually online. And with that, we'll open it up for any questions. And Stefana, thanks for your insight.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
I'm just going to check the chat and see if anyone's posted anything. I don't see any particular questions. Stefana, thank you again very much for your time. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap the session.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.